January 13th, 1964. A brutal winter storm ravaged the Appalachian Mountains, bringing sub-freezing temperatures and heaps of snow to the region. The blizzard was terrible, forcing the community indoors. Schools were closed, and travel should have stopped until the storm was over. However, in the middle of the Cold War, the Air Force was always active. Regardless of circumstance, the Strategic Air Command would have planes in the air. Often used by the Air Force during the Cold War was the B-52 bomber aircraft. The first B-52 plane was flown in 1952 after originally being designed by Boeing in 1944. The B-52 was commonly used in Operation Chrome Dome, which were 24-hour covert missions during the Cold War. Boeing designed several models of their coveted B-52, with each new model fixing a malfunction of its predecessors. By 1964, they were using model B-52Ds. The new model of the B-52 was being flown over New Mexico by a test crew in order to determine how high turbulence could affect the structure of the plane. The test mission resulted in the detachment of the vertical stabilizer, the piece of the plane that provides direction and stability. Luckily, the plane managed to avoid disaster and land safely. Flashing forward to January 13th, 1964. Another B-52 took flight in the United States. Flight Buzz 14. This flight was supposed to be a quick, routine flight from Massachusetts to Georgia, so the plane could be recommissioned after landing. However, it was the malfunction of the vertical stabilizer on the B-52 Model D that ultimately caused the plane to lose control.
What caused this crash was a known structural defect in these planes. The vertical stabilizer being about 40 feet high, it was susceptible to snapping off in high winds. They knew it, but they were reluctant to take these planes out of service because of nuclear threat at the time.
Just as the vertical stabilizer was torn from a B-52 in New Mexico only 3 days earlier, Buzz 14's tail was ripped from the rest of the plane. Without a vertical stabilizer to provide directional stability to the aircraft, pilot Tom McCormick was left with little options. Major McCormick ordered his men to eject before the plane collided with the ground, sending the crew into a frightening blizzard in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. The Cold War was a period of political and military tension between the Soviet Union and the United States. This conflict was ultimately brought upon as an unwanted outcome of World War II. As the World War in Europe came to a close, the two superpowers of the Soviet Union and the United States engaged in a power struggle to influence Eastern Europe as well as other parts of the world. The United States of America and the Soviet Union rose from the ashes of the war as two of the globe's strongest nations, but conflict arose from their vastly different political and economic systems. The United States was known for being a highly respected country with a mixed market economy, while the Soviet Union was a communist nation, allowing their government to control all factors of production and resources. Therefore, political anxiety and distrust spread throughout each nation. The countries experienced a conflict of interest in the Korean War, as the Soviets backed the communist North Korean state, while the United States supported democratic South Korea. The Korean War escalated fear among Americans that another world war could erupt from the confrontation of the Soviet Union and the United States. The post-Korean War era was characterized by fear that communism may infiltrate our government. Known as the Red Scare, this fear became more prevalent in America, and tensions continued to rise, perpetuated by the anti-communist hysteria inflamed by U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy. Each nation was aware that they both possessed nuclear weapons, capable of causing mutually assured destruction. In October of 1962, nuclear war nearly became a reality. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day standoff between President John F. Kennedy of the United States and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, testing the limits of each nation's leader.
The Cuban crisis came the closest to us going to war. But was it a scary time? Absolutely, yeah.
Fortunately, logic intervened, and nuclear war was averted. The Cuban Missile Crisis served to stabilize relations between the United States and the Soviet Union to such an extent that a direct line was established between the White House and the Kremlin, yet the Cold War was far from over. As power transferred hands from Khrushchev to Leonid Brezhnev in the Soviet Union, they continued to strengthen their ballistic program in an attempt to gain an upper hand. Since intercontinental ballistic missiles were capable of delivering a thermonuclear warhead across the globe, nuclear anxiety was heightened. Therefore, the United States proceeded to expand on their own nuclear offensive. Operation Chrome Dome was a series of secret missions exercised by the United States Air Force using B-52 aircrafts during the Cold War from 1960 to 1968. The name Chrome Dome was one of many code names created by General Thomas S. Power, who at the time was Commander-in-Chief of the Strategic Air Command. The Strategic Air Command ran the Chrome Dome operations as well as the deployment of the B-52 bombers.
They were 24-hour cover missions. They went 24 hours. Airplane would take off. I was stationed out at Wright-Patterson. We flew them for about 6 months. And there were usually three airplanes in the air at any given point in time from SAC. SAC was tasked with strategic bombing of the world, essentially. And we were prepared to do it. We just knew that our job was to protect the United States.
Specifically, the B-52's role in these missions was to remain airborne on constant alert to retaliate in case of Soviet attack. The missions, primarily lasting 24 hours or more, involved B-52 circling Allied airspace near the edge of the Soviet border before returning to American airspace. The B-52s were consistently armed with thermonuclear weapons, ready to act as a deterrent against Soviet nuclear aggression.
But what that was just showing strength to Russia that, hey, you know, don't fool around with us, we're not going to put up with it. Kennedy was good at that point.
But anyhow, to keep the Russians on edge, they started flying missions from the United States around to Alaska, across to the Mediterranean, and I think there was something they're going through North Africa. And I do believe that helped bring the Russians to saying, hey, we're not going to win this.
At any given time, there were as many as 16 B-52s regularly flying worldwide, carrying nuclear weapons. Incidents seemed to be unavoidable. There are 5 recorded crashes during Operation Chrome Dome involving the B-52 aircraft. All of these accidents can also be categorized as broken arrow events, referring to incidents where a nuclear weapon was not under our direct control, without leading to the risk of nuclear war. 2 of these mishaps involved the United States B-52 intentionally jettisoning nuclear weapons on our allies in Denmark and Spain prior to crashing. Yet, one accident in particular hit close to home. On January 13th of 1964, a regular Chrome Dome mission turned into a catastrophe as Flight Buzz 14 crashed on Savage Mountain near Barton, Maryland. Flight Buzz 14 began with a minor malfunction that required an emergency stop to be made at Morón Air Force Base in Spain. After a temporary mechanical fix was made, the flight continued to Westover Air Force Base in Chicopee, Massachusetts. Upon return to the United States, the exhausted crew of Flight Buzz 14 needed to be relieved. 5 airmen from Georgia were assigned the mission of flying the aircraft from Massachusetts to Turner Air Force Base in Albany, Georgia, to be recommissioned. The airmen included Major Thomas W. McCormick, pilot, Captain Parker Mac Peden, co-pilot, Major Robert E. Townley, radar bombardier, Major Robert Lee Payne, navigator, and Tech Sergeant Melvin D. Wooten, tail gunner. The flight to Georgia was expected to be a routine mission for the airmen, yet unexpected circumstances caused the mission to go horribly wrong. It was January 13th, 1964, in the Appalachian Mountains. A bitter winter storm was taking place, ravaging the area with fierce winds, heavy snow, and sub-freezing temperatures.
And that winter snow was waist deep. It was a terrific storm that preceded that bomber coming down. In fact, that's what brought it down.
However, horrendous weather wasn't the only obstacle the crew of Buzz 14 faced during their flight. B-52s had experienced a common defect involving malfunction of the vertical stabilizer. Just 3 days earlier, on a test mission in New Mexico, high winds blew the vertical stabilizer off another B-52. Unfortunately, the blizzard and hurricane-like winds in the Appalachian Mountains would cause Flight Buzz 14's vertical stabilizer to be torn off the aircraft as well.
The problem was the tail was attached at the thinnest part of the aircraft, which was in the back, and it had a horseshoe clamp, basically a large clamp shaped like a horseshoe that attached it to the fuselage. And what happened when they came over Salisbury, they hit winds, lateral winds, some of them in excess of 125 miles an hour.
In the midst of a massive snowstorm, Major Tom McCormick and his crew were flying south over Pennsylvania when they encountered severe turbulence. In a frantic exchange with Cleveland Air Traffic Control, Major McCormick attempted to change altitude with the hopes that the turbulence would subside. In just a few minutes, at approximately 1:38 a.m., turbulence became so violent that it ripped off the vertical stabilizer and tore off the back half of the plane.
Bottom line is, the plane should have never taken off.
The aircraft began to spin uncontrollably, prompting the crew to engage injection protocol and abandon the aircraft.
The aircraft traveled approximately 21 miles out of control at a speed of about 400 miles an hour.
Tech Sergeant Wooten was the first of the crew members to eject from Flight Buzz 14.
The first one out was Major Wooten, and when he ejected, the plane, pieces of the plane hit him, and he broke his leg, and he was torn up on one side of his body.
Next to eject were Major McCormick and Captain Peden. The last to eject was Major Payne. Typically, the navigator would release before the co-pilot and pilot, but Major Payne was attempting to help Major Townley get strapped into his seat. Major Townley had gone to the bathroom and wasn't able to get back into his seat in time.
When you get an ejection order, you have to be strapped in your seat very well because you're shooting out of the plane at 500 miles an hour also. Plane's going 500, you're going 500. He couldn't get strapped in his seat fast enough, so he went down with the plane and he ended up here.
As the rest of the crew became scattered about western Maryland and southwest Pennsylvania, Flight Buzz 14 and the 2 thermonuclear weapons it was carrying struck the ground of Jesse Green's farm and proceeded to somersault its way to rest atop Savage Mountain in Garrett County, Maryland. As the flight came to a violent end, the rest of Buzz 14's crew began to fight against the odds for their lives. Tech Sergeant Melvin Wooten, the first to eject, landed near Salisbury, Pennsylvania, in a field near the Castleman River with a compound fracture of his femur. In an attempt to find shelter, he crawled across the field, following the lights of Salisbury. What Tech Sergeant Wooten didn't know was that the river lay directly in his path to civilization. He slid down the bank of the river, landed in the freezing water, where he would stay for 5 days until his body was discovered frozen solid in the Castleman River.
A high school student was skipping school, and he was going around shoveling people's driveways out. Well, he saw this orange parachute out in the field and went down, and he decided to go back and get his dad, got his dad, and they went down there, and sure enough, this was the final guy.
He said, "There's a set of trucks, take them." He looked at me and said, "Do you know what you're looking for?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "There's a man here someplace." So I took the tracks. He's here. He was half frozen in the ice and half out. So I went back to the parachute. He said, "I'll go make the phone call."
Dean Hilligus, a broadcaster for WFRB, flew overhead and reported the ordeal.
There was the body frozen into the ice. I can still see that arm sticking up out of the ice.
Major Wooten's body was then transported via helicopter to the Cumberland Airport. The pilot of the flight, Major Tom McCormick, next to eject, landed in the woods near the Stonehouse Farm in Grantsville, Maryland. During his rough ejection from the plane, Major McCormick crashed into a tree and broke many branches on the way down. Putting his survival training to use, he used the broken branches to make a fire and managed to form his parachute into a makeshift shelter. Trudging through 3 feet of snow, Major McCormick stumbled upon safety at Stonehouse Farm. A young boy at the farm came to Major McCormick's aid and attempted to help him by warming his feet.
And another story came along. He told his wife that if he ever was in a plane crash to stay by the phone because he was going to call her and tell her everything was okay. So the first thing he did was to get on the phone, make a collect call to his wife, and say he was okay.
He was then given a hearty breakfast and was transported to the hospital for treatment. McCormick's co-pilot, Captain Parker Mac Peden, who ejected at the same time as McCormick, also landed in Garrett County, Maryland, near New Germany Road. Captain Peden executed many of the same strategies as his pilot, making a fire and forming a tent out of his parachute. Yet rather than attempting to find civilization, he decided to stay put overnight and through the next day. With the Civil Air Patrol flying overhead, Captain Peden became innovative. Using a broken mirror and his bright orange parachute, he signaled for the Civil Air Patrol to come to his rescue. 3 rescuers came and discovered Captain Peden in his tent shortly after.
They sent 3 people up to rescue him, and when they got to him, they were so tired they needed to be rescued. But he was sitting in his tent thinking, what's he going to say? He knew they were coming, so he thought, what am I going to say when they arrive? So they finally got there, and he said, hey boys, come on into my living room, it's nice and warm in here.
The men from the Civil Air Patrol then escorted Captain Peden to Jenkins Farm, where he was taken care of. Major Robert Payne, the last to eject, landed in Savage River State Forest, in the worst possible place, as he had made a last-ditch effort to help Townley. Major Payne was left with very little options upon his landing, as his parachute and survival pack both got caught high in the trees. Adding to his misfortune, he was only wearing a summer flight suit, since he expected a routine flight from Georgia. Upon descending the hill where he landed, in the middle of the night, in 3 feet of snow, Major Payne could not see Poplar Lick Creek and fell in. He was fighting against the odds from the beginning. Freezing and without supplies, he activated his survival training and attempted to follow the stream out of the forest. Sadly, the weather proved too deadly, and Major Payne froze to death before he could make it out. Rescuers discovered Major Payne 2 days later.
Savage River State Forest, and you can see there's a big hill behind us and a big hill this way. It's just a terrible location to be in, especially in a summer flight suit. I wouldn't want to be here in the wintertime in a full winter clothing to try to get out of here, because it's 2.5 miles that way to Savage River Road and 2.5 miles that way to New Germany Road. So with no road like this or no good conditions, you have to go through the snow and through the woods. It was impossible. He just couldn't survive.
Major Townley, unable to eject, was found 2 days later in the wreckage of the plane by members of the Civil Air Patrol.
A plane crash is 10 times worse than a car crash, because when a plane crashes, the body is aluminum, mostly. And aluminum, when a plane crashes, it's like taking 10 brand new cars and crushing them. And you got all these sharp edges. And of course, in a car, you're talking about steel, but in an aircraft, you're aluminum. When aluminum snaps, it's like a razor blade. And when a plane crashes, you don't find everybody as the way they used to be, put it that way. That's about the best I could put without getting into graphics.
The crash of Flight Buzz 14 was a truly devastating catastrophe that impacted the families of crew members, the Strategic Air Command, and our community as a whole. Good men were lost, and lives were changed. The legacy of the crew of Flight Buzz 14 will remain an integral facet of our community. In a week full of catastrophe, one positive aspect of the crash of Flight Buzz 14 was the way the community of Allegheny and Garrett County came together. When they were called upon, the people were there, ready to help in any way possible.
Because for the first 24 hours, the people of Allegheny County were in charge of that operation. And this was a broken arrow. I mean, this is a big deal. The people of Allegheny County and Garrett County made the difference.
The community's involvement began as soon as Flight Buzz 14 made impact with the ground of Jesse Green's farm in Garrett County. At the time of the crash, Jesse Green was standing outside on his porch and saw the plane flying overhead. He then put on winter clothing and started out to the crash site, but decided to turn back after hearing what he thought were gunshots. In reality, they were just bullets exploding in the flames of the wreckage. The Air Force ordered the Civil Air Patrol located in Fairmont, West Virginia, to respond to the crash. The Civil Air Patrol, led by Head of Operations Sterling Queen, was tasked with retrieving the nuclear bombs that went down with the plane and securing the crash site from civilians.
So the first thing they did, they called the Civil Air Patrol from West Virginia in Fairmont. Those guys all mobilized and got here somehow from Fairmont. Cordoned off the area. They had armed guard people around here to keep the local people out. Of course, the local people knew about it. And they wanted to come in and see it and get, you know, souvenirs or whatever.
We couldn't let him see those weapons. We confiscated film from anybody that come close. We took their camera away from them, took the film out, threw it away, gave them the camera, and read the riot act to them, and they decided spared to go someplace else where it's warmer. And some other people got close, but under threat, they turned around and went back. So we had that to cope with. But what happened with that, the people we run off went back and told other people, don't go in there, you'll get shot. Because they said, there's crazy people in there wearing parkas.
The Civil Air Patrol was authorized to use deadly force in order to protect the bombs. The problem was, their guns had frozen, causing them to be unusable. The weather was so extreme that a member of the Civil Air Patrol nearly froze to death.
It was 30-some degrees below when we got there, and the second night it dropped down to 42 degrees below zero.
The Civil Air Patrol actually used the two massive bombs as windbreaks and even sat on top of them.
Who could say they ever seen a nuclear weapon, let alone set on one of them? I'm sitting on it and patting on it, say, hey, big buddy, don't blow up right now, I'm sitting on you.
The weapons were second to third generation hydrogen bombs with incredible force when detonated.
And these weapons were thermonuclear. They're not the small stuff like was dropped on Japan in World War II in 1945. These are the big boys. Yeah. But these nuclear weapons, put this way, each one of them, and I'll say this without giving the secret, was 100 times plus more powerful than the ones dropped on Japan.
The bombs were in fairy condition, meaning the fuses were not connected. Therefore, there was little, if any, chance of detonation. However, they were still given paramount attention. One of the bombs actually began to leak a yellowish, discolored liquid, causing some mild concern among the Civil Air Patrol. The Civil Air Patrol played an integral role in securing both the crash site itself and the fallen nuclear bombs. While the Civil Air Patrol did their part at the crash site, the people of Western Maryland played a monumental role in the aftermath of the crash.
Trail that the military was totally unprepared for this, but the people of Allegheny County and Garrett County came together and made it happen. Country folk just came in and just set up an entire command system and took care of this incident.
The citizens of Allegheny and Garrett County immediately jumped into action. Since the military was caught unprepared, the community stepped up to the table. Search parties were formed from community members eager to help rescue the lost airmen of Flight Buzz 14. Schools in the area even canceled classes so students could help. However, searching for the crew members was no easy task. They took risks of their own by venturing into the unforgiving cold for many hours at a time.
They had 6 or 7 searchers looking for him. 3 or 4 of them fell in the river and had to go back, and 3 of them took his body out, and it's quite a story there too.
On the Friday morning after the crash, a high school student named Ron Holler was shoveling snow when he noticed an orange parachute in a field in Salisbury, Pennsylvania. Following a path in the snow, Holler stumbled upon Tech Sergeant Wooten, frozen in the Castleman River. The searchers took few breaks, resting for a meal, and then going back out and searching some more. Without the efforts of the many men and women who searched for the crew, this disastrous situation could have been far worse. In addition to those helping with the search, much of the community mobilized in other ways. St. John's Lutheran Church provided a refuge for volunteers and military personnel alike. The church supplied 3 hot meals a day, a place to briefly rest, and a chance to shower. The American Red Cross donated many of these useful items, including cots, to the church.
We had tables downstairs to eat, and then upstairs we have the sanctuary and then another big room, and we had cots in all of those. Yeah, they were all volunteered. And some of our people that belonged to our church would come in, you know, would mosey in and see if there was anything they could do. And sometimes there were, but there were people coming and going the whole time.
The volunteers at the church, though not directly involved with the search for the crew, played an integral part in the success of the searchers and the military personnel. Dean Hilligus and the WFRB radio station provided the area of Western Maryland with aerial commentary of both the crashed B-52 and the area where Major Wooten was found. Hilligus and his crew provided the community with live coverage of the search. At this point in the search, all of the flyers had been accounted for except Wooten. Hilligus offered to fly out to Salisbury as he was very familiar with the area, but Ron Haller had already found the body. Hilligus flew out regardless and became a witness to the discovery of Melvin Wooten.
I said, we found him. You know, it was just like, finally, we have an end to this whole event and this whole week.
WFRB radio concentrated all of its time and effort to the coverage of the crash.
It was a mixed emotions because we were sad because they didn't make it. Several of them didn't make it, but then you're happy for the ones that did. And as we look back, monetarily, the week was a loss. But emotionally, the week was a winner.
Hazel Knotts did a morning program called At Home with Hazel and provided updates to the community and families of the crew. After all the crew members were accounted for, the 2 thermonuclear bombs sitting in the crash site still needed to be attended to. The Air Force was struggling to find a way to get the bombs to the airport, so Windy Miller offered to bring trucks from M&S Stone Quarry to get the bombs to Cumberland. However, the owner of M&S Stone Quarry had mixed thoughts about loading his trucks with nuclear bombs, so they got mattresses from a local boys' forestry to cushion the weapons from any external threats.
But later on, they asked Ray Giacone, the news people, what would you have done if those bombs would have gone off? And he said, well, it's sort of like this. Right now, I'm in the stone business. If they'd have gone off, I'd be in the gravel business.
Not only did the community of Western Maryland contribute in the aftermath of the crash of Flight Buzz 14, but they have kept the legacy of the crew alive in the years since the plane came down. Memorials were donated from local companies to honor the deceased crew members. In the summer of 1964, a memorial service was held in Garrett County, Maryland, that included a parade from Grantsville to the memorial sites, a speaker from the Air Force, and a B-52 flyover. In 2014, for the 50th anniversary of the crash, members of the community attempted to recreate the service that took place in 1964. Among the hundreds of attendees at the 50th anniversary were senators and representatives, as well as decorated members of the Air Force. Dean Hilligus, from WFRB, served as the MC for the program. Families of 4 of the 5 crew members attended the anniversary. The 50th anniversary memorial service was intended to honor the crew members of the fallen B-52 and the community that aided in the search and recovery of the airmen. Flight Buzz 14 will forever be a memorable event that shook the community of Western Maryland and the nation as a whole. In the midst of the Cold War and Chrome Dome operations, the crash of Buzz 14 added to the growing anxiety surrounding American and Soviet relations. Not only were the locals worried, but high-ranking government officials became involved in the aftermath of the crash. The crash site was controlled by the Civil Air Patrol, who were in constant contact with the Pentagon and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Curtis LeMay. The crash was an overwhelming catastrophe that affected the lives of every person involved. Major Tom McCormick and Captain Parker Peden would go on to live long lives after the crash, while Major Robert Payne, Major Robert Townley, and Tech Sergeant Melvin Wooten would have memorials erected in their memory. The crew of Flight Buzz 14 will be remembered for generations to come. The crash impacted not only the crew of the flight, but also the residents of Western Maryland. The community came together in an amazing way to help the crashed airmen. The people of Allegheny and Garrett County aided in the aftermath of the crash in a variety of ways, by helping search for the crew, providing a safe haven for searchers and military personnel alike, and offering the community and families involved with current updates of the search. The people of Allegheny County were an integral aspect of the search, recovery, and logistical operations surrounding this hometown catastrophe. Flight Buzz 14 left a lasting impact on the crew, their families, the Air Force, and the community of Western Maryland. The legacy and struggle of this crew will never be forgotten.